Your summer dew, just in time for high holidays. Exactly.
Almost beginning to feel it.
So, good afternoon. How is the Torah written? How is the record of it kept? Basic version of the story. Right? We have this thing called Torah, but do we have the original Torah that was at Mount Sinai?
Maybe.
No. I mean, do we have the physical,
No.
actual, one that Moses' hands touched? No. So, how did that transmission work?
You mean the Masorah?
Yeah.
The idea of transmission?
Yeah, but no, the physical.
Oh.
Right? We got Mount Sinai here, and then we've got us here. Presumably.
Tavo says it. It was given to Moses, dictated to Moses, given to the elders.
All right, but you're missing a step. If I have a Torah, and I want to get the Torah a few thousand years later,
You need to make a copy.
thank you.
Right.
It has to be copied.
Right.
Okay, it has to be copied. But
It's a mitzvah.
it is a mitzvah to make a copy of the Torah, right? There's no copyright on it, which means anyone is allowed to make a copy. But which copy do you make a copy of? And if there's a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, that can sometimes be an issue. So how do you make sure you have the right copy? Well, this is actually covered in our tradition's understanding of part of Parashat Tavo. And that's what we're going to wrestle with today. It's a weighty problem with an interesting solution. So we're in Parashat Tavo, of course, but we're going to be looking at chapter 27 today. And this is page 1144. Chapter 27, the book of Deuteronomy, and we're going to start at the first line. Someone can decide who wants to volunteer to read. Thank you.
Moses and the elders of Israel charged the people, saying, "Observe all the instruction that I enjoin upon you this day."
All right. And by the way, again, it's not actually using the word instruction, but using the word mitzvah that I give you this day. And instruction is a different word. But carry on.
As soon as you have crossed the Jordan into the land that the Lord your God is giving you, set up large stones. Coat them with plaster and inscribe upon them all the words of this teaching.
And there we have the word Torah.
Cross over to enter the land that the Lord your God is giving you, a land flowing with milk and honey, as the Lord, the God of your fathers, promised you. Upon crossing the Jordan, you shall set up these stones, about which I charge you this day, on Mount Ebal, and coat them with plaster.
Okay, so what's happening? What are we doing?
We're setting up large stones.
All right.
Outlets or-
We're making big stones,
Covered with plaster, so
Torah henge,
you can write,
and then
inscribe or carve something into the plaster.
right, so they're being plastered over. So now we've got a nice smooth surface and something that can be written on or engraved.
Yeah, it says inscribed.
And then,
It means to incise into the plaster.
and then,
And then we're supposed to write the Torah on those stones.
All the words of this teaching.
the whole Torah
That's what it says.
on rocks.
Yeah.
That's like,
How many more
It's
rocks?
a large rock.
that's a lot of rocks.
It depends how small your writing is.
Torah henge.
It does depend upon how small your writing is, but I mean that's a significant amount of writing to be going on to. And then what happens? Well,
You have to do the same on the other side of the Jordan. This is on the eastern part of.
How many are we making? Are we making one set with plasters on one side of the
One
Jordan
side.
and one side on the other?
Looks like
But wait a minute. Verse 2, as soon as you've crossed the Jordan, right, you set up the large stones. But then verse 4, upon crossing the Jordan, you will set up the stones. But then we also coat them with plaster. Are we coating them with plaster before we write, after we write, before and after we write?
It seems to be saying it twice, but the Torah never.
There's never just a redundancy.
Twice, where there's always a reason for it.
Okay, and as long as we're talking about stones, says the Torah, let's keep going a little bit further. So, verse 5, if you will.
There too you shall build an altar to the Lord your God, an altar of stones. Do not wield an iron tool over them. You must build the altar of the Lord your God of unhewn stones. You shall offer on it burnt offerings to the Lord your God, and you shall sacrifice there offerings of well-being and eat them, rejoicing before the Lord your God. And on those stones you shall inscribe every word of this teaching most distinctly.
Which stones am I writing on again?
Those would be
There are
by
two
the
sets.
altar.
Right, we've also got an altar going on here, right? So we got this Torah hinge thing, and then we've got an altar that's being built of stones. And at least for the altar, we're not supposed to use iron implements, that they are unhewn stones. But what about the other stones? But then we're also told to, again, to write the Torah on the stones. Confusing, isn't it?
It is.
Yes, good. And we've been reading this our whole lives, and you never once knew that you were confused. That's one of the joys of being a rabbi. So you get to show people that
I've
they're
read this many times, but I never thought about it in detail.
and that's why we study. All right, so we're going to have to wrestle with a few of these ideas here. First of all, we have to figure out what is it that makes a stone hewn or unhewn, as the translation puts it. And to do that, we're just going to do a little quick dip into Mishnah Torah by Rambam. Go ahead and figure out what an unhewn stone is like.
Any stone that was chipped enough to catch the fingernail, as with a shakita knife, it is unfit for the ramp and for the altar, as it says. Whole stones build the altar of God.
Oh, wait. Whole stones? It said unhewn stones. Why would this translation of Rambam say whole stones? Anyone looking at verse 6? Avanim what?
Shlemut.
Shlemot, right?
Complete.
Complete, whole. Right, now, the translator took the next step and said a whole stone is one that hasn't been hewn, that hasn't been carved, but the Hebrew itself is saying that it is a whole stone, a complete stone, a stone.
Virgin.
Well,
I know.
it kind of, and in fact, that's the direction that Rambam is about to go. Of okay, so where do I find these stones? Right, where do I find these whole stones?
Where did they get the stones from? Virgin ground. They would dig down to where it was obvious that this soil is not for cultivating or building, and take out whole stones. Or they would take rocks from the Mediterranean Sea and build with those. Similarly, the stones of the temple and the courtyards were also whole.
All right, so why do we want to avoid the layer of ground where cultivation could happen or building could happen?
Because they're being chipped from plowing.
Yeah, that the plows have probably gone through there year after year and chipped up some of those stones. The pickaxes, when people were laying foundations, would have probably chipped some of those stones. You might not see it immediately, but the chips and the dings and the scratches would have been there. So you have to dig down deep enough to find stones that no one would have touched by this point, and then take those out to use to build with. Make sense? And that's why also ocean stones were considered fine. Right? It wasn't that they couldn't have been damaged by other rocks. That's called geology. It was they couldn't have been damaged by human activity.
Metal.
Well, specifically metal,
Metal.
exactly. But the wholeness, even if you were carving it with like wood, would still be a problem. Not that I think wood carves stone all that much.
Other stones.
I mean, it's a lot of knowledge of the terrain and
Mhm.
where are you gonna find these stones and stones that have to be.
Yeah.
It's,
Not easy.
no, I know you got a lot of people, but it's not
It's very, very particular of how these stones are being prepared.
right.
Makes it so special.
It is exactly, and also part of what helps us understand what was meant by it. Rambam is going to get to a little bit more in the next passage. Keep going.
The temple is not to be built at night, as it says, and on the day the tabernacle was erected. That is, we erect it during the day, but not at night. We may work on the construction from dawn until the stars come out, and everyone is obligated to build, helping physically and financially, both men and women, just like the sanctuary in the desert. However, we do not take children from schools to build the temple, build the temple, override Shabbat or the festivals.
All right. So when it comes time for putting these stones together and making something out of them, we do it during the day because that's how the Mishkan was built, and we're using the temple as a mirror for the Mishkan, and everybody has to participate. If you're physically able, then you are physically helping with the building or the collecting of the stones or any part of that. If you're not physically able, then you are at the very least financially supporting this endeavor. This is not a big donor project. This is something for everybody to be participating in. But I always thought it was very interesting the way Rambam put a little caveat at the end. Not only does this not override Shabbat and Yom Tov, which we know, of course, as well from the Mishkan, because that's that juxtaposition that the Mishkan was not built on Shabbat is where we get the idea that the categories of labor used for the Mishkan are the categories of labor that we don't do on Shabbat. But also, we don't take kids out of school to do this. Now, that makes no sense. Right? What better spiritual endeavor could there be for children than carrying the stones of the temple?
But if they're in school, they know why it's important.
Because what are they carrying in school?
Torah.
Right.
And then they can teach their children, and if you take them out, you're breaking this.
Exactly right. As much as important as these stones are, as important as the building is, the Torah the children are learning is more important than the stones that are being built. And therefore, you don't take kids out of school to build the temple. It's just a very interesting insight, I thought. All right. But let's get back to these whole stones, because Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai drives home a little bit more of what is meant by this wholeness that we're talking about here.
Zakkai said, of full shlomot stones you shall build the altar of the Lord your God. Stones which make peace, shalom.
Right, so that's his drash. Right, what are shlemot stones? What are whole stones? Stones that create shalom. Right, so we're not talking about the status of the stones when they're being used. We're talking about the effect of the stones when they are being used in practice.
Shlemot is the same root as peace.
Exactly,
Shalom.
right. Because peace is not just about I'm not shooting you. Peace is about having wholeness and completeness and harmony. And part of that is not being shot at, but it's more than that. It's this overriding goal of Judaism is to have that shalom, that harmony, peace. But he drives that point further.
Now, does this not follow a fortiori? If stones which do not see, and which do not hear, and which do not speak, make peace between Israel and their Father in heaven. Scripture writes, you shall not lift iron over them. Then a man who makes peace between a man and his wife, between family and family, between city and city, between country and country, and between one people and another, or so will calamity not befall him.
Right? Lovely midrash, where he says, if the stones of the altar, which make peace between us and God, should not be hit with iron, a person who makes peace between people should not be hit with iron. That if weapons should never be raised against the altar, then weapons should never be raised against the peacemaker. Because they are creating the same shalom that these stones did. And people are much more important than rocks. As the rocks are. They don't see, they don't hear, right? They're not living things, whereas a person is. So for those that try to make peace, we should show them the utmost respect, and we should give them the utmost defense for those that are working so hard to try and create shalom, which is the value embodied within the altar, within the temple, within the Torah itself.
Yeah.
Very good. All right. Well, let's get back to those words, right? Because I remember I left a little question mark hanging up here about the Torah being written on the stones. So,
You are to inscribe on them all the words of this Torah. This teaches that the entire Torah was written on these stones. This is also the view of Rambam, who writes, for we have found in the book of Haggai that the entire Torah was inscribed upon them, starting with Genesis and concluding with the words, before the eyes of the whole of Israel.
which is the last sentence in the Torah.
All the decorations of the letters, which we are familiar with, were the model from which the script of the Torah nowadays was copied.
All right, so Ramban and Rabbeinu Bachya, quoting him, they are of the opinion that indeed the entire Torah was written, but not only was the entire Torah written, but it was written precisely as you would write a Torah that was going to be used in the sanctuary. That this was the Ur copy. This was going to be the ultimate test stone, that if you wanted to make sure the Torah was correct to this one, and then you would know your copy of the Torah was right. And this would be something you could be going back to over and over and over again to check, unlike parchment scrolls, which will occasionally deteriorate and eventually will be in error, or might have been written in error simply because of a scribal mistake. But if everybody can check it against this one master copy, then everyone has it. What else does this do? By having this master copy made this way.
Everyone can check it.
Everyone can check it, right? It's no longer the priests that are checking to make sure the Torahs are right. Everyone can check it. And if your priest says, and the Lord God commanded that you give the priest all your money, people can walk over and go, where do you see that? I don't see that written on this stone. By writing it on stone, it becomes uneditable, and by writing it on stone, it becomes public. The Torah, a much more secure document than a private document held only by the priestly class. Pretty smart, but also hard.
The law school I went to, our library had Code of Hammurabi,
Mhm.
the image. It's a large stone.
Right.
The entire code is on it, and it's little
Tiny font.
tiny print.
and so,
That was, it was to represent the oldest part of the law library,
Right.
which is the laws are always public. In
Right.
all good cultures.
Do we agree that it is truly inscribed and cut into the plaster,
as opposed to,
painted on, written on with ink?
well, it does seem to be talking about,
Because then it wouldn't be permanent.
it does definitely talk about inscribing, right? That is that they are meant to be written onto them, and it does seem to indicate a more permanent. But even still, the plaster seems to be the surface, and if the plaster is the surface, plaster deteriorates, right? The stone may be forever, but the plaster coating, if that's what's being either written on or carved into, that is not permanent, because plaster will eventually dissolve and fade. You can find some ancient pieces of plaster, but you don't find it just easily. It's only in certain places. So that might still be a problem.
And then the carving, wouldn't the carving be a problem? Because you have to use some method.
If you were carving on the stone itself,
Yeah.
now your stones have been blemished because you've scratched into the stone.
Plaster,
Plaster is very soft.
when it's, before it dries.
Even when it dries, straight
Yeah.
plaster, you can easily scratch with
Yeah.
your fingernail.
With the finger.
But I mean, there are ways to increase the ratios of the ingredients in plaster that can stiffen it up.
Right, they made water cisterns that were plastered.
Right.
Yeah.
That were not quite so easily damaged. So we can imagine a harder type of plaster, but it's still not stone. And if we're writing on the stone, it's still a problem. But the other question here is the whole Torah?
The whole Torah.
Right? This is still a large body of literature. And indeed, Ramban and Rabbeinu Bachya may believe this, but not every commentator believes it was the whole Torah. The opinion of Ibn Ezra and Sadia Gaon in the next section.
Ibn Ezra writes, quoting Rav Sadia Gaon, that the list of the commandments was inscribed on these stones in a manner similar to the well-known work Halakha,
Gedolot, which was an early work that was a listing of the commandments. Much like now, if you look up online quite easily a list of mitzvot, you'll get a whole list of the 613. They're not written as the whole Torah is. They're little synopsis sentences of each one, and you don't have the narrative in between. You don't have the additional explanations in between. It's just do this, don't do that, do this, don't do that. Keep going.
where these commandments are recorded in the form of warnings of what to do and what not to do. The words bear hetev,
Right, that's our final words of verse 8, where it says that these should be written, and then it says all of these words, ba'er hetev, which we read as being most distinctly, they're translating differently.
normally understood as a clearly comprehensible language, mean and legible script, and do not refer to interpretation.
Right, so Sadia Gaon as well as Ibn Ezra are arguing, as we're going to see different than some other commentators, that the only thing that was written on this was a list. It was just like bullet points of the mitzvah. No interpretation, no rest of the Torah text, just the bullet points.
Claim that the entire text of the Torah was inscribed on these stones with careful attention given to the crowns on all the letters. And the text was translated and inscribed in 70 languages.
We're going to come back to that.
Rashi, either the stones were exceedingly large, or there was a miracle that enabled the scribes to accomplish this.
All right, so here's the problem, says Tur HaAruch. You want to say the entire Torah was written. We can kind of work that out on a stone, or a set of stones. With, like you said, with the, like the Rosetta Stone, the Kohen Hammurabi stones. I mean, we can see that being put onto tablets. And certainly there are Egyptian places where they have whole walls covered in inscriptions. We could imagine the entire Torah being done that. When we unroll a Torah in our sanctuary, we can usually get from the ark all the way to the front door. So imagine, make a taller stone, taller than a Torah scroll. Imagine that such a monument. With interpretation, with translation into 70 languages, so that there would be 70 times a copy of the Torah. That's a lot. That's a lot. So it's a lot of stone. So he's saying you either go with a list, and doing a list of the 613 70 times is conceivable. It's not, it's not out of the realm of nature. It must have been a miracle. Because there's no way that you can write 70 copies of the Torah, let alone Torah plus interpretation, on these stones and not still be writing them. I mean, it would just have been a mammoth undertaking and a monstrous monument to have all of this there. But we'll come back to why they thought that in a little bit.
Where did the 70 languages come from? Where was the direction?
We'll come back to that in a little bit. Right, the 70 language issue is going to come up a little bit more just later on. And I knew it was going to be a danger of tossing that in there, but I wanted to keep his commentary intact. Right now, we're just working on the who was putting what on what, and then we'll talk about why they thought that was what was being put on it. All right, so Chizkuni, he goes a little bit further, again, basing himself off Rashi.
The Torah decrees 3 times that such stones shall be set up. River Jordan, once in Gilgal, of the Israelites after crossing that river, and the 3rd time at the base of Mount Ebal.
All right, so he takes this verse as well as others in the Torah and says, each time it says set up the stones, it meant different stones. And so that this became even more public and more out there because they were setting up these stones routinely so that you would leave behind these monuments of the Torah in all these different places. All right, keep going.
Afterward, they brought the stones and they built the altar and plastered it with plaster. On it, all of the words of the Torah in 70 languages, as it is stated, clearly elucidated.
Right, but Hetev, they're coming back to again. What does it mean to be written clearly elucidated or well distinctly? What do those 2 words at the end of verse 8 mean? How do you clearly write something only in Hebrew? Because it won't be clear to people who don't speak Hebrew. The only way that you can clearly write something is to write it in the languages of the whole world. And 70 languages was considered the number of languages in the entire world at the time of the rabbis. So anytime they say 70 languages, they basically mean universal translation. Every language imaginable. That way, everyone would be able to read it. Everyone would be able to read it. But what was the purpose of the Torah? I mean, I know we said it's a public document, but is it an international document?
It's the law of the land.
Right? But the land is supposed to be the Israelites.
If you have someone who wanders into this land who may not be familiar with the law of this place.
So you're saying the American legal system have copies of every American statute copied over into every language in the world in order that anybody who came to our country would be able to have an accurate reading of that law.
I would say that they have to have fair notice.
That we have laws.
Fair notice that we have laws, and
But
familiarize yourself with them. Here they are.
But do we have copies of all American laws written in every language in the world?
I think so.
Really? We published like the congressional record in Tibetan? I mean,
Not in any language.
For immigrants who come here, they're required to study American law, you know,
Yeah.
during their citizenship process, and there must be translations.
there must be some.
Some.
Not every language. But here, I mean, again, when they say 70, they're not putting a hard limit on that at 70. They're saying 70 because they mean every.
Every language
Right.
spoken.
70 languages is all of the world in the minds of the ancient rabbis. They were imagining that this could be comprehensible to every nation on earth. And that's kind of weird, which is why we're going to keep going.
The sages taught. How did the Jewish people write the Torah? Rabbi Yehuda says they wrote it on stones, as it is stated, and you shall write on the stones all the words of this law. They plastered them over with plaster.
What? What's the problem here?
Carving into the stone.
Well, let's imagine that he's talking about writing, that they just use ink to write on the stones. And then they put plaster over the top of
You
it.
cover it up.
Yeah, it's covered over.
Yeah. I can see that.
Well, now, if the stones were simply a reminder of the covenant, right, a reminder of that breed, a monument, then we don't actually need the words written on them. We just need to know the words are there.
Correct.
The same way that many Jews don't actually want to see what's inside the Torah. Torah is there, and they're quite happy to see it inside the covering rather than unrolled in front of them so that they can study it. So perhaps what he's saying is this monument was simply meant to be a monument, to know that the covenant was there under that plaster. It was keeping it safe, because otherwise, the writing might come off.
So the plaster was like a preservative.
Exactly. It was that way you knew. It's like a time capsule, if you will.
Yeah.
Right? You don't need to take a grave for someone. You don't need to keep digging someone out of the grave to know they're in there. Right? There's a marker on top that says there's a person inside here, and we trust that the person is still inside there. And there's a marker here that says God gave us a Torah, and the words are underneath this plaster, and that's good enough. Happy faces. Seems a little odd. Well, there are rabbis in the Talmud who also think it's odd.
Rabbi Shimon said to him, according to your statement that they plastered over the writing, nations of the world study Torah. He said to him,
Wait, who? How did who?
The nations.
the nations, again, these wandering hypothetical people I mentioned, that are wandering through the land, by the land, and study.
I don't see the word wandering here. The sages seem to, or Rabbi Shimon seems to believe that they were expected to study Torah, that the nations were supposed to come and study from this giant monolith. May not have been mono, trilith, quadrilith, to study Torah. And he's worried that if we plaster over it, these nations won't be able to. Right? If we keep Torah secret from them, they're not going to know with us. And so they come up with an explanation of how this can work, even with the plaster. Keep going.
But he said to him, the Holy One, blessed be he, granted them an extra degree of understanding. And they sent their scribes, notarim, and they peeled off the plaster and copied it down. And on account of this matter, their decree to be sent to the pit of destruction was sealed. And once the Torah was in their possession, they studied it, and they did not study.
Okay. I get a lot of confused looks. All right, so let's take the middle part first. Right? How did they get access to the Torah? They were given a particular trick, a particular knowledge by God to know how to remove the plaster and to then be able to copy the words down. So even though the Torah had been concealed, God allowed them to unconceal it, which meant they had access to it. And because they had access to it,
Now they're required to learn.
now they're responsible, right? And by study, he doesn't just mean that they would not, sit and read Bereshit. It means that they would not learn from the Torah how they were meant to live. Not necessarily to keep all of the mitzvot the way we keep all the mitzvot, but to understand that there is a God, that idolatry is prohibited, that murder is prohibited, all the other things that the ancient pagans were not so good at remembering, that we can hold them accountable, or more importantly, God can hold them accountable, because they had a chance to peek inside to see what was real, and then they chose to ignore it.
Before they were ignorant, then they're no longer ignorant, so they don't have an excuse for time.
Exactly right. When your 1-year-old slaps you, right? It's just, they're playing and they slap you. You don't send them to their room to think about what they've done, because they don't know any better. But when your 18-year-old slaps you, you probably have a very different reaction. And that's because in the meantime, they were supposed to have learned slapping people is not okay. So too, what we're balancing here is, what is our reaction to the other nations of the world? Do they know or don't they know what's right and wrong? If they don't know, then we can't really hold them accountable. But if they do know, then absolutely they are responsible for their behavior the same way that an adult is responsible for their behavior. Alternative explanation from Rabbi Shimon.
Rabbi Shimon says, this is not what happened. Rather, the Jewish people wrote the text of the Torah on top of the plaster below for the Gentiles to read that the verse commands the Jewish people to destroy the Gentile inhabitants of Eretz Israel, lest they teach you to do like all their abominations. You derive from the fact that they wrote this verse that if the Gentiles who lived in Eretz Israel would have repented, the Jews would have accepted them, that is, allowed them to live.
All right, so what's Rabbi Shimon's opinion? Anyone want to give me the summary? That it was it written under the plaster or on top of the plaster?
It says on top.
On top, and why did Rabbi Shimon think that was important? It was a warning. Right? You can't warn people by hiding the warning. If you have a like danger radiation sign and you turn it around backwards on the wall, who are you helping? But what he's saying is that if somebody who wasn't Jewish, who was one of these ancient Canaanite pagan groups, came along and saw a stone and it said to have to wipe you out because you guys are going to be a constant source of trap and teaching them to do your abominations, that would let the person know, I should probably stop doing those abominations. I should probably stop worshiping idols. Get out of Dodge, because this is telling me what the consequences are going to be of me sticking around.
I'm very confused. They wrote the Torah on top of the plaster.
Right?
On the
Outer
surface.
layer, right.
Right. And they wrote below for the Gentiles. Now, I mean below.
Translation.
Or inside.
No, below on the same level of plaster, right? So that there should be a translation for them.
But only this verse that commands the Jewish people.
Not only, but the idea that Rabbi Shimon is driving at here is that this would have been an extremely important verse for them to be aware of, right? That as much as they should also be aware of God as creator and God as redeemer and God as commander for all of these other things, their most immediate concern would have been, God, we're in trouble if we don't give up the way we're living, because right now we are a danger to these people. And that means we need to stop what we're doing that's dangerous so that they won't have to drive us out or kill us. The preferred solution is what Rabbi Shimon is saying. Right? The preferred solution was shalom. Remember, these stones were designed to make peace. And sometimes you have to let people know what you're doing is going to force me to respond. So how about if we fix what's happening so that that response doesn't need to kick in? Again, as we talked about with the 1-year-old and the 18-year-old, if you never teach the 1-year-old not to slap people, then when that 1-year-old is 18 and slaps someone, how can you blame them for slapping? Taught them, now they're responsible. And in any event, you know that slapping is going to get them in trouble. So it's your obligation to teach them not to slap people.
But you might also, and they have an obligation not to do that, but the obligation to repent.
Exactly.
So you've been wholeness and repentance.
Well, how would an idolater have known that what they were doing was wrong? None of them was doing idolatry. So how would they have known it was wrong unless it was made public? So the public knowledge that's being described here of the Torah and the laying it out there was not wholly for our benefit. It was for the benefit of the world. And the gift of the Torah was not solely for our benefit. The gift of the Torah was for the world. I'm still very proud that even though it hasn't mainly been thanks to us, nevertheless, in the end, the Bible is the most translated book in the entire world. I wish that was more thanks to our efforts rather than others. But I'm glad that it's out there at least, because the Torah is meant to be shared with the world. It's not meant to be covered under or covered over with plaster and kept as some sort of secret that only very select people can peel off and see that hidden thing. It is supposed to be accessible and meaningful for everyone.
In a very visible way, this is making it a light to all the nations.
Absolutely.
Putting it up on the right way, and plaster.
Yep.
White plaster, up
Yep.
high.
Big
on the
shining
mountain.
white stone.
This is the equivalent of a big flashing sign.
It's a billboard.
in the ancient world. This
Yes.
is making a light to nations around. They're going to see this up there.
It's almost like neon. Exactly. But that is it's a very stark and very different reminder of one of our responsibilities as Jews, which is to make the light of the Torah be seen by more people. Cover it and coat it and hide it. But it is meant to be reflected and shown outwards rather than just inwards. Inward light, good, powerful, amazing, needed, but also outward.
It also creates a sense of justice.
Mhm.
Because if you say this is the law of our land, you know, the United States would say, you know, ignorance of the law is no excuse. You know, you didn't know that
Right.
was a law we had here in our little community. And now you have to pay the fine or
Right.
whatever it is. And just because you didn't know doesn't get you off.
Right, which is still true. You know,
Which is
just because I didn't know that murder was wrong doesn't mean I'm going to be set free. But
If there's a big billboard before you walk in that says things are punishable,
and whose responsibility is it to make the billboard?
the people who live there.
Exactly. Right. It's not your responsibility to, I mean, it is your responsibility to learn the law of the country you move to. But it is even more basically the people who live in that country's responsibility to make the laws that they live by widely known. Stranger or local resident will know what those laws are.
Which doesn't happen here, actually.
No, it doesn't happen in most countries because most laws that are made are either so specific or so narrow that unless you're actually interested in that particular part of tax law or that particular part of construction law or that particular part of the civil code, you're not going to know it. We don't go to great efforts to publish the laws of our land. And that's a shame. But I'm not solely responsible for American publications of laws, but I am partly responsible for trying to make sure that Torah goes out and trying to make sure that the laws reach not only our people, but reach other people as well. It's one reason why I have that camera sitting here staring at me for all my classes. Just as they knew that the average non-Jewish person wasn't going to wander into a school to start learning Torah. That the average non-Jewish person, if we're lucky, might buy a book, might watch a YouTube, might hear about it through some other ways, like giant white plastered stones. That is partly our responsibility, is to make sure that that's out there. Because remember, what we said about the building of the temple itself, you don't take kids out of school to do it. Because what's most important is the Torah, not the building. And that's true not only for our own children, but for the children all around us, that everybody needs to know these basic truths and these basic ideas. Doesn't mean that we force them to obey. It doesn't mean that we have, inquisitions or anything like that, God forbid. But it does mean that we have to share if we expect other people to be able to benefit from it as well. And that should be our expectation. Good? Good. Tavo. When you